Good morning. Welcome to the Cofnod How to Record Reptiles course. Today we're going to be joined by Mick Brummage and Wolfgang Wuster, our two Vice County recorders for reptiles who cover North Wales. Okay. Right, a brief course outline. This course will last about 1.5 hours, and I'll start with a basic introduction to recording. Unfortunately, my colleague Aisling won't be able to join us today. I've picked up her course slides, so we'll be able to cover a lot of the points she's raised. We'll also have a quick session for questions at the end. Then in part two, Mick Brummage and Wolfgang, they'll take the reins and go in far more detail about reptile recording and how to make the best records possible using a lot of the tips they will be imparting to you. And then we'll take questions as well after that. Okay, what is a record? Well, essentially it's these 4 W's. So what have you seen? In this case, it's an adder. You can either record it using the common name or the scientific name, Vipera birus. Then, of course, you need to know where it is. So, location where you've made this record. So, Bangor, Great Orme. Don't put something like my garden because that's a meaningless site name to anyone but yourself. And obviously, if you've got a grid reference, put that in as well. You can derive grid references from a number of methods, so you'll see later in the course how best to achieve that. Then, of course, when the record needs a date, so try to be as exact as possible. You can obviously put a year in it, put it in at a year level if you want, if that's all you've got, if you're decanting records from an old literature source, for instance. But ideally, we want the day, month, and year, but you can put it as the season or the month, year. Okay, and then, of course, who made the record? It's usually you, but put your full name, preferably. Once again, don't put me. It's a meaningless thing for a record. Okay, so the big question is, why do you record? Well, there's a number of reasons for doing recording, and they're all equally valid. So, personal interest, for instance, you might just be interested in natural history and want to keep a list of what you've seen. Well, yeah, fine. Conservation reasons, records are very useful for informing conservation decisions. And then we have national species atlases. If you can participate in these, you're helping to fill in the picture across the whole of Britain. And of course, biological data is very useful for informing planning decisions. So if people don't know where unusual species are, they can't avoid damaging them if there's development or the like. So bear that in mind. And of course, your records can feed into other national atlases, such as the State of Nature report, national atlases like that dragonfly one I've illustrated there. And it's a fun thing to do, is recording. So in normal times, outside of COVID, you could go out with your mates and record species. So there's a picture of the bryophyte group locally here. Right, so what do you actually want to record? Well, essentially everything, every biological species is worthy of a record, but things that are common now may not be in the future. So if you were to ask a Victorian, record red squirrels, they'd think, well, why bother? They're everywhere. Well, not anymore, they're not. So think to the future. Record common stuff now because things could change. Rarities are always interesting to record, of course, but yeah, don't become a rarity hunter. Common stuff too. And useful for building up trends in the common species. So more records, the better. I did say record everything, but really don't go to town on this. You don't want hourly records from one location of a certain species. So use your common sense and just maybe record once in a while or thereabouts. Okay, so you've made your record. Now you want to find out a bit more information about the species you've recorded. Well, is it rare in your area? It's quite difficult to find these things out, but fortunately we've got an adhering system now. That's a sort of consortium of all 4 Welsh record centres who pooled their biological records into one searchable database. And you can access this and view it by this web link here. And you can either search by species group or just by species. There's certain protected species that aren't available, but it's essentially a free search, so just bear that in mind. And then, of course, there's a more specific online resource called the Reptile and Amphibian Conservation ARC Reptile Atlas. I've fluffed that name, but there you go. You can see what it is. Essentially, it covers the whole of Wales and it enables you to map all our reptiles and amphibians. You can also submit your sightings through that as well, so a very useful resource. So do check that out. Okay, Cofnod database. This is part of Ashling's presentation, so I won't be able to do it justice, but I'm sure I'll try and cover the main bases. Okay, Cofnod database. Well, we've got over 4 million records in total, 4 million biological records. That's a fair amount of records, really, just for North Wales. And reptiles only form quite a small proportion of that. There's only 1.3% of our records are reptiles and amphibians. So you can see things like birds, invertebrates, it's a bit of a catch-all category, but these are where the main body of our records are from, obviously plants as well. Now we've got 57,000 amphibian and reptile records on the database, and of those 14,000 are reptile records. So you can see they're not that well recorded, but there's certainly room for improvement as well. Okay, so where do these records come from? Well, only about 9% of them are actually coming in via our website, either directly typed in. So that's for all species, and 90% of them, or thereabouts, are actually imported via spreadsheets from specialist data sets. Now, this sort of pattern reverses when you just look at reptile data, and a whopping 60% of it is actually from people directly typing it in to our systems. So that's ORS records, and only about 40% is coming in from imported spreadsheets and the like. It just shows you that the ORS is a very important system for registering your reptile records online. Okay, so as I said, most of it comes in through Cofnod ORS. Vice County recorders, excellent source for biological records, as Mick, etc. will attest to, no doubt. Individual recorders, so people see something interesting, record it, goes on the system. And then the specialist surveys like Wales Sand Lizard Monitoring Project, which will be talked about later in this course, really. And we get various data sets from consultants as well. Right. Okay, so I'll take you through roughly how you put a biological record in on the Cofnod ORS. This will just be a whistle-stop tour, really. I'm not going to labour it too much because I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it. Right. Okay, so the ORS has been around quite a long time. In fact, it was one of the first online recording systems for biological data in the UK, which is quite surprising. So you forget how long it's been in use. So 14 years, first launched in 2006. It had a second incarnation in 2009, and there's a new version, the third version, coming in 2021. That's going to be available to use on smartphones as well. So it's one of these adaptive websites. So that should be really useful. So keep an eye out for that. It should be available shortly, hopefully. Okay, and all our systems are designed in-house. So Tim May is our IT man, and he writes all this amazing, whizzy technical stuff that we use. So we're very lucky in that respect. The nice thing about using Tim is that if we find problems, he just resolves them, or if we want it adapted, it gets adapted to what our requirements are. So that's great, simply because we're not wasting all that time haranguing a third party to actually develop software for us. So much easier. Okay. And of course, there's specific recording projects, which we'll cover later. Right, so you've logged onto the Cofnod website, and this is what you're confronted with, the home page. So the bit we're interested in is Cofnod ORS, so online recording scheme. So the first thing is to actually register if you haven't done so before. So it's free to register. You can either click here or you can register here. What it'll do, it'll ask you for some registration details, email, password, that sort of thing. It's all free, and we don't use it for marketing purposes, so you don't have to worry about that. You can also sign up to our newsletter if you wish to hear about future courses and the like. So yeah, all controllable by yourselves. And then you want to have a look what you've got. Well, you've got an enter records area and a view records area, the basic things. There's also some interesting things like this interactive map that you can use to plot your grid reference, and also a species dictionary, which is great. If you're not quite sure how to spell a scientific name, you can find things that way. Useful to know the English and Welsh and scientific names. So all our systems are bilingual as well, which is fantastic. You can use them either in English or Welsh. So yeah, you put your records in, and it will give you a little lowdown, a little summary there. You can change your details at any time yourself. So you can go into here, maybe your emails change, your ISP's changed, maybe you've moved house, want to update your details, change your password, do it all through there. And there's just our standard fake recorder, and you can see the sort of information you can put in there. You don't have to put in things like telephone numbers, or job titles, or mailing list. You can either opt in or opt out. Right. So we'll just take you through some standard recording methods here. So you want to enter a record, you can either do it through a standard entry system, which is probably the majority of your records, or a specific project. So for instance, if you're recording hedgehogs, you might want to use this one. Swifts, you might want to use this one. They're just slightly different forms that ask extra information, but you're more than welcome to use the standard form if you want, because it'll cover most bases really. But nice to have those specific schemes, as they do ask for additional useful ecology data. So you'll be confronted with a screen like this, and you can fill it in. It's self-explanatory really. There's drop downs there that guide you through it. There's also a little help button, that question mark, that you can press to find out more information. Okay, so you're going to select for your species name. First, you've got to choose the group. So that's just to shrink down the number of options that you have to consider. So in our case, we'd pick the bottom one, reptiles and amphibians, and away we'd go. There's also these padlocks are quite useful if you want to lock a particular field in place. Say you've got several records from one site and one grid reference, you can lock them. and then that information that you've typed in will be retained for the next record. Saves you having to type it in again. Okay, so you can also view your records. So I've shown you roughly what you do with entering records. View records, you can either look at the records you put in via a project, or you can view your standard everyday records. Right. Okay, so viewing your records, it is some fictitious data here. You can interrogate it. Now, very useful thing about this is that you can map your own records, or you can even map a selection of them. So you could select all by ticking that, or you can tick individual ones and map them. So this area is good. You can leave a comment on a record. Say you submitted a record a couple of weeks ago and found a notebook with some extra information in or something, and you just want to leave a note against that record, you could add it there. And there's also a filter. That filter is useful if you just want to search by particularly a year, or maybe a site or a species or something like that. So yeah, gives you various options there. Look, so you can quickly select out, if you've got thousands of records, exactly what you're after. Okay, so downloading and mapping your own records. Well, you've got these two options in the top right corner, so filter and tools. This is where you can map your records. So you can also download them in a variety of formats. You can also list unique species. That's quite nice if you've got several years worth of recording and want to know how many different species have I seen. You can use that. Likewise, you can filter by site and then do a search for unique species and have a site list. So quite powerful, really. And there's a map that you'd get. So you can see there's different resolutions mapped there. So some of the points in blue are quite small. They're probably, I don't know, I guess they're 6-figure grid references. And you've got maybe a tetrad and maybe a monad there. So it's quite a useful way of displaying things. And yeah, you can zoom in, you can change the background map to an aerial photo. As you zoom in, that changes too. You can apply different layers as well. So it's just worth playing around with this and using it to its full potential, really. Okay, record statuses. Well, you might notice at the side of your records, in view records, that you've got these little coloured circles. Well, they signify the sort of stage it's going through. So, I don't know, sometimes they're left unassessed because nobody's actually looking at them, or there's no Vice County recorder to check. But if a Vice County recorder has checked these, you'll see, I don't know, probably correct or known correct. They've been checked. If there's an incorrect record, you might see one of the reddish colours appear. And then there's other colours that are in use that you probably won't see too often. The light bulb actually shows that the record is being used on the Cofnod database. So it's a live record and is being used for reports. So just useful to know, really. Yeah, okay. That's there. And there's a few contact details. We're dead easy to find. Obviously, you've booked onto this course, so you've found the Cofnod website already. There's general email there, telephone number. I wouldn't necessarily bother with that at the moment in COVID times, but yep, there we go. You can find a local expert on our website as well. So say you want to know who the county bird recorder is, the local reptile recorder, so on and so forth. Go onto our website and that resource will allow you to send them an email via the system. Right, well, unfortunately Mandy can't join us today, but she's kindly sent me a video and I'm hoping it's going to play all right. So just bear with me, sometimes these things are a bit temperamental.
Hello, I'm Mandy Cartwight and I'm the North Wales Officer for Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Trust. We are the national organisation that is committed to conserving amphibian and reptiles and saving the disappearing habitats on which they depend on. Our vision very much sees amphibian and reptiles thriving in their natural habitats and a society inspired and committed to their conservation. In North Wales, we work with a wide range of partner organisations and volunteers to help with this vision. We actively encourage people to record reptiles in any scenario, from organised monitoring programmes such as the Sand Lizard Reintroduction Programme to spotting a lizard, grass snake, adder out on your walk or wherever you may be. Every single record is important as it contributes to both regional and national statistics and helps us understand more about their population ranges and where we can help them best. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I hope that you enjoy the course and be inspired to help and record lizards in the future. Thank you and good luck.
I also got involved with NUARN, the North East Wales Amphibian and Reptile Network. I'll say more about them in a minute. And I discovered that there were very few reptile records in the area that were known, and little attention being given to reptiles as a group. So I volunteered to become reptile recorder. My area in North East Wales covers the Vice counties of Flintshire and Denbighshire, which roughly equate to the present counties of Wrexham, Flintshire, Denbighshire, and the part of Conwy to the east of the Conwy Valley. I started to collect any existing records I could find, and then when Cofnod started up in 2006, I passed them over to Cofnod, and since then I upload all my records directly to Cofnod via the ORS. So NUARN is one of the UK amphibian and reptile groups. Most counties or regions have one. There's also one in North West Wales, which I'm sure Wolfgang will talk about later. UKR promotes and coordinates amphibian and reptile conservation, mainly for volunteers. I'm now going to show you some pictures and distribution maps, if I can get my presentation up. There's a box in front of the, here we are, I think. Okay. So what species are we talking about in North East Wales and indeed Wales as a whole? There are 5 native species. 4 of them are generally termed widespread, although less so these days. So you've got the common lizard, slowworm, grass snake and adder, and then there's one rare species, the sand lizard, with a very restricted distribution. So the common lizard comes in a variety of shades and colours, generally the browns at the top left, but you can get very dark ones, including melanistic, the black one bottom left, and occasionally a very nice green one, which can be misidentified as a sand lizard. The distribution in North East Wales, this is taken from the online atlas that Richard talked about. It shows current records, which are termed to be those in the past 10 years. And the squares on the screen are 5 kilometre squares to give a broad overview. If you go onto the atlas, you can actually look at different resolutions from 10 kilometre squares right down to 1 kilometre square, so quite detailed. You might like to look at the area around where you live or sites that you know, see if reptiles have been recorded recently. If not, try and fill in some of the gaps. And you can see there are, even though the common lizard is widespread, there are quite some significant gaps, especially that one around Denbighshire and westwards towards the Conwy Valley. The slowworm, I'm sure you know, a legless lizard, can grow up to about 50 centimetres in length, comes in a variety of shades of grey and brown, sometimes melanistic, and some old specimens can develop very nice blue spotting. And the distribution slightly less than the common lizard. I should have said the common lizard is found in both upland and lowland areas. The slowworm is predominantly in the lowland areas, and again there are large gaps in the distribution, particularly that area to the west of Denby, again, the coastal areas inland from Rill and Prestatyn, and a lot of the area down the Dee Valley, and then to the southeast of Wrexham, going down to that spot down near Ellesmere. That's the Fens, Wixell and Bettersfield Mosses National Nature Reserve, very, very good reptile site, but generally there are very few records between Wrexham and the nature reserve. Going on to the grass snake, our largest snake, can grow over 1 metre in length, generally olive green, various shades of green, has the very characteristic yellow and black collar and the barred flanks. Again, it's more of a lowland species, usually associated with wetland habitats where it feeds on amphibians and small fish. But as you can see, considerable gaps again in the distribution. Interestingly, no current records at Fens and Wixell Mosses, even though there were records in the past. The adder, a smaller snake than the grass snake, grows up to about 70 centimetres, although usually more like 50 or 60 centimetres. Of course, our only venomous snake has the characteristic dark zigzag down the back. The males are usually light grey with black markings, and the females light brown with dark brown markings. It's the least widespread of the 4 so-called widespread species, and most of the records, current records, are in the upland areas, places like Hiraethog and Clwynog Forest and Rhuaben and Minera Mountains. The only good population, even a large population that we know in the lowlands now, is at Fens and Wixell Mosses down there in the southeast. The sand lizard, a bit bigger than the common lizard. Common lizard's usually only up to about 15 or 16 centimetres. The sand lizard can grow up to about 20, and it's a chunkier lizard. The males develop these lovely lime green flanks in the breeding season. The females, there at the bottom, are much more cryptic with shades of grey and brown. And this, in northeast Wales, it's only found on the Gronant Dunes and Talacra Warren sand dune system that lies between Prestatyn and the Point of Ayr. And it was reintroduced here over a number of years, starting in 2003, having died out in Wales during the 50s and 60s. And it has also been reintroduced to several other dune systems in other parts of Wales. I want to go on to just talk briefly about some sources of information that can help you learn more about reptiles and how to find them in the field. This is a very good field guide by Howard Innes. It has very good descriptions of the reptiles, talks about their life cycle and behaviour, and there's some good general information about reptile habitats and on survey and recording. And then online, the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation website has some very good information on each of the species and their habitats. And you can also download this reptile identification guide, and there are various other leaflets you can download. And then another very useful site, the National Amphibian and Recording Scheme, NARS. I'll particularly point you to the top right corner, the resources for surveyors and resources for training. There's some very good information there on reptile ID, reptile ecology, on carrying out surveys and field technique, and a very good habitat guide, lots of photos of reptile habitats. So I would strongly recommend looking at that website. NARS itself, I won't say much about. It's actually in the process of being revised and adapted, and I think there will actually be a new website coming online in the next month or so. If you can't find NARS, then if it's been changed, then look on the ARC website, and I'm sure there'll be a link to the new scheme there. Just finally, before I go out of the PowerPoint, some useful links. Some of them have been covered already. So the online atlas, the ARC Trust, NARS and ARG UK. And also it's quite useful to follow some of the Facebook groups. The UK Amphibian and Reptile Group Discussion Forum, and then 3 field naturalist sites, one on adders, grass snakes and sand lizards. And there are other groups, of course, that you might be able to find, but these are particularly good. So I'm going to come out of this now. Right.
Okay.
I'll carry on without the PowerPoint. I want to talk about what equipment that will help you record reptiles in the field. Basically, all you need is a good pair of eyes, but it is very useful to have some close focusing binoculars. This allows you to get good views of the reptiles, maybe 2, 3 or more meters ahead of you without disturbing them. I find it very useful to check, for example, if what I think is a reptile lurking in vegetation is actually a reptile before I get too close. Very useful to have a camera to take a record shot of the animal. You really need a camera with a telephoto lens, so a digital SLR or a bridge camera. I favour a bridge camera. It's just more portable, lighter to carry around in the field, and it gives you a very good range of zoom from about 25 millimeters up to 500-600 millimeter range. Of course, you can take pictures with a mobile phone, but it does mean you'll need to get much closer and you'll risk disturbing the animal. You'll need an Ordnance Survey map to accurately locate your record and produce a grid reference. But better still, use a GPS unit like this one. This is a fairly basic model, a Garmin eTrex 10, costs about £80, perhaps less in some places. And in theory will give you a GPS location accurate to a meter, although in practice it's only accurate to about 3 meters. And then finally you'll need a notebook, a field notebook. although if you have a GPS, you can add all your notes to the entry on your GPS. That's what I do. I very rarely now record anything on paper in the field, and the GPS also has the advantage that you can download all your information to your computer when you get home. Next, once you've got your equipment and you're in the field, what do you record? Richard already has covered the basics, so the obvious site name, date, which species, and the grid reference. Ideally, as a minimum, we look for a 6-figure grid reference, so that would give you an accuracy to about 100 meters, but preferably an 8 or a 10-figure grid reference, so giving you an accuracy to 10 meters or 1 meter in theory. So ideally using a GPS, but if you're using a map, then you can get a 6-figure grid reference. The other thing you can do, which is very useful, when you get home, use the interactive map on the Cofnod website. That enables you to zoom in onto your location using the OS base map, and then that, as you zoom in further, that turns into an aerial photo, and hopefully you can locate your reptile more accurately. You click on the spot and it'll give you a very accurate grid reference. Other things to record, if possible, the age class of the animal. So is it an adult, a sub-adult, or a juvenile, and what sex is it? That takes a bit more experience, but very useful if you can. Also record the habitat type. So are you on a sand dune, a heathland, rough grassland? And then finally, of course, if you can, take a photo, provides you with a record, and you can upload that record to Cofnod, and it makes my job verifying the record much more easy. Moving on briefly to talk about fieldcraft. So the skills that you need to be able to go out into the field and regularly find reptiles. So it's really the importance of learning the when and the where, so to give you the best chance of finding reptiles when they're out basking, and that can be for relatively short time periods during the day. They're so-called cold-blooded, so they're ectothermic. They take their body temperature from the external environment. They have to warm up to start and achieve their optimum body temperature of maybe between 25 and 30 degrees centigrade, ideally. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but the when, you have to consider what time of year, what time of day, what the weather is like on the day. So what is the air temperature, the cloud cover, the wind speed and direction. And then, of course, you have to think about where you're looking, which habitats, and where within those habitats the reptiles are likely to be basking. So places like sunny south-facing banks, sheltered gaps in the vegetation and longer vegetation, along the south-facing edge of scrub, and you're aiming to locate reptiles 2 to 3 meters ahead, so you can have a good view, hopefully take a photo, and then move away without disturbing the animal. It takes quite a bit of time to develop those skills, and it can be very frustrating to start with. In fact, it can be frustrating even when you're quite experienced. It's not that difficult to go out in the field and you think you've judge the conditions just right, and yet you end up not seeing any or very few reptiles. So it does need quite a bit of patience, but I always feel, even if I don't see any reptiles, then it's just nice being out in the field, and there's always something else of interest to see. But I would recommend using those online resources to look at techniques for improving your field skills and learning to identify reptile habitat, so particularly the NARS website. From time to time, there are reptile survey training courses organised in North East Wales, but because of COVID, there aren't any plans yet this year. But I suggest you keep an eye on the Cofnod website, the news section on the home page. Finally, finish by talking about a couple of opportunities for you to help with monitoring projects in North East Wales if you're interested. One is on sand lizards and the other on adders. The North East Wales Sand Lizard Monitoring Project was set up in 2008. It's a partnership between Denbighshire and Flintshire councils, ARC, NRW and 2 landowners. There's a team of about 10 to 12 trained surveyors, and each year there's a rota set up so that each of the 3 reintroduction sites on the Gronington to Lacra Dune system are surveyed weekly during 2 periods of the year, April, May and June, when the lizards are breeding and egg laying, and then in September and October when the hatchling lizards appear. It's always more useful to have more people involved to spread the load. Because the sand lizard is a European protected species, then you would need to be licensed to carry out surveys. So you would need some training, and we usually run a training day each spring. And you would then need to gain some experience by going out with a license surveying for the surveyor for the first year. If you're interested, please contact Liam Blasey, who's the biodiversity officer for Denbighshire, who organises the surveys. The Adder Monitoring Project, the North East Wales Adder Monitoring Project, that's a new project. It was due to start last year, but hopefully will begin later this spring once the COVID restrictions are eased. The aim is to check the current status of adders on sites where they've been recorded in the past, and to try and find some new sites, mainly in Denbighshire, but also in some neighbouring areas. It's an initiative of Denbighshire, and it follows on from the adder being adopted by Denbighshire County Council as a priority species in its corporate plan. And again, please contact Liam Blasey if you're interested in helping. He'll be setting up a rota of volunteers to survey selected sites, and he'll also be providing some on-site training. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Wolfgang to talk to you about the North West Wales situation.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Mick. Just to introduce myself, I'm Wolfgang Wuster. I work as a reader at Bangor University. I've been here since 1994, and I gradually got into local recording, partly by being involved in the founding of the North West Wales Amphibian and Reptile Group, which has since become something of a field herping arm of the Bangor University Herpetological Society. If there's anybody here who is a civilian, not a student, in Northwest Wales who's interested in getting involved, it would be great to have more local community involvement rather than it being effectively a student endeavour. So please do let me know if anybody is interested. And basically I became involved through that and was then asked to act as recorder for the Northwest Wales Vice Counties. So I'm kind of going to pick up where Mick left off, and rather than focusing particularly on Northwest Wales matters, I'm just going to talk a bit more on how to make things more useful. Basically, this is me saying, okay, I'm the Vice County recorder. This is what I wish I could see on more people's records, and this is how you can make your recording more useful. So I'll talk briefly about some of the uses for records, which Richard has already touched on. Then about how you can make your own records more useful, particularly by providing photos and descriptions of what you're seeing. And then some additional things that you could be doing while recording, or how you can make, if you're going out to record specifically for reptiles, how can you do things that are more useful than just opportunistic records, although opportunistic records are of course great and probably the mainstay of the database. So uses for records, first of all, for local planning. So all reptiles are protected against killing or injury, which means that if there's any planning for any sort of construction or anything like that, harm to reptiles needs to be avoided. Clearly, for that to happen, they need to be on the radar, and Cofnod records are the best way of putting them on the radar. If there are reptile records nearby, then hopefully local authorities and ecologists and so on will think, yeah, we need to plan for reptiles for this development and make sure that reptiles aren't harmed and that surveys and mitigation are put in place. If there are no records anywhere near there, then it may well turn out to be the case that reptiles are simply ignored altogether. Very much to their detriment. And obviously land management and conservation. So there are particularly sensitive habitats for reptiles like habernacula, for things like adders, basking and mating areas and things like that, which could in theory guide conservation management. So if there's a nice adder hibernaculum, it would be really great if it didn't get flayed and overgrazed as part of heathland management. Doesn't always happen that way, but at least if it's on the record, then there's some chance of perhaps altering management practice and conservation practice for the better. So how can you make records more useful? So as the recorder and verifier, this is what I see when I see a record. So the top bit here with the name taken out is what I see, common frog, and I'm asked to verify this, and I can classify it into these different categories of what I think, how correct that record is. Richard showed us the colored circles, which is basically what this will result in. And I've got known incorrect, probably correct, known correct or unconfirmed. Now, if I've got a record here and all I can see is it's a frog, then I kind of have to take it on trust that the person knows the difference between a frog and a toad. And I'll probably tick a record as probably correct, unless I've got good reason to doubt it. But if that person has supplied a photo, then I'm really happy, because here's a photo, and yes, that definitely is a common frog, and therefore I can tick that as known correct, and I actually feel that my job was worthwhile, because otherwise really I'm just guessing. And that can certainly help catch a few howlers. So here's one that I just got just a few days ago, which showed a common lizard. Now I think we'll assume they didn't mean the hedgehog, but those two things on the right, that's clearly a palmate newt. So because there's a photo, we can correct that record and just flag it up as known incorrect, at which point Cofnod staff can then change it over to the correct identification. If I hadn't had the photo, I would probably have somewhat reluctantly and hesitatingly ticked probably correct, and we would have had an erroneous record of common lizards in the system. Or if it had looked really suspicious, I could have put in probably incorrect, but it would have been a very unsatisfying situation. So if you can at all get a photo, and even if it's your 10th one at that locality, it'd be really great if that gets submitted with every record. It just makes the verifier's job so much easier and more rewarding, and really enhances the quality of the database. Most of the time, I don't know who the recorders are. So it just, who recorded these observations. So I don't know these people. I have no idea whether they know their newts from their lizards or whatever. So it really helps to have photos. If you can't get photos, then having a description is really great as well. So here's one example, somebody talking about spawn clumps. The photo didn't come with that records, but they talk about spawn clumps. the only amphibian that lays spawn in clumps is a common frog. So because they said clumps rather than just spawn, I'm happy to call it a common frog. Toads lay their spawn as long strings, okay? And then again, in other cases where a record may be subject to doubt, it can be really useful. So here's one of a grass snake from Amluch, which would have been quite a surprising location. And it then provides a description. Never seen one before. Neighbor said it was a slow worm around a foot long, shiny gold. Now, grass snakes are many things, but they're not shiny gold, whereas slow worms are often quite metallic. So I think we can very confidently say that that record, in fact, was a slow worm, and we can correct that away from grass snakes. So having a description of what you saw, a description of the animal, even brief, a description of what it was doing, a description of what its spawn looked like, anything like that is really quite useful, even if you can't get a photo. So please supply some extra info that really helps confirm IDs. Then recording with a purpose, okay, I think a lot of records are probably opportunistic. Somebody goes out, sees something interesting and records it, that's wonderful. But there are many ways of actually trying to contribute further. And Mick already mentioned some of those, so filling recording gaps. There are lots and lots of gaps, I'll come back to those. There's some real mysteries about reptile distributions in Northwest Wales that you could contribute towards solving. And there's longer term monitoring schemes and other contributions that you can make. So we've already talked about the Wales Online Amphibian and Reptile Atlas, which shows us what's known and from where. We've seen this slide. This is all the records. The darker the squares, the more species recorded for all native reptiles and amphibians. But we can look at this at a better scale, and we can also see where the gaps are. So if you look at 5 kilometers square for the whole of North and Mid Wales, we can already see that there's a whole bunch of 5 kilometer squares without a single native reptile record. Mick already mentioned that area inland from eastern Conwy and western Denbighshire, inland from Colwyn Bay and Abergele and so on. Parts of Anglesey, central Anglesey, and even some coastal bits, which are usually good for herbs, have nothing. Parts of the Clean have nothing. And then Mid Wales is a bit of a desert. And that's at 5 kilometer resolution. When you look at it at 1 kilometer resolution, you can really see what the gaps are and how many places have had very little in the way of recording. So that gives you some idea where to look. So if you can identify suitable habitats in places where there are no records, then perhaps it's a good idea to head out there and see whether there is something in those neglected areas. Another thing that you will see if you compare former occurrence areas and current occurrence areas is quite significant discrepancies. So these are older records prior to 2011 for the adder in North Wales, and this is the current distribution. And if we toggle back and forth between those, we can see that interestingly there are some new records, some new squares that were previously unoccupied, but there are also a lot of squares where there are no post-2011 adder records. Now, it would be really nice if we had some idea whether those places where there are no current records, but there are older records, has the adder really disappeared there, or does it still persist in small populations that might benefit from some management or conservation action? So try and find pastures new to record and to find out what's happened to these populations. Are they really gone or are they still there? That would be a really useful contribution. Then there's some real mysteries. Are there grass snakes on Angleseas? I've had many, many discussions about that over the 25 years I've lived in Wales. If we turn to the Atlas, now there's at least half a dozen or so records from Anglesey in the Wales Online Amphibian Reptile Atlas, all prior to 2011. And when we go to the present day, there are absolutely none. So what's up with the grass snake on Anglesey? Well, there's some older records, but this is one that we already talked to, the one that was shiny gold from Amluch, which is almost certainly a slow worm. Then there's one here, 4 grass snake eggs observed on the bank of a pond in Cors el Reiniog in 2016. Grass snakes don't really just lay their eggs on the banks of ponds, so that seems a very unlikely record. Here's one under a rock in a churchyard in Llangollen. Now I can't totally exclude that, but that really does sound like a slow worm. So we've got these older records, but we've got no real idea. Wouldn't it be nice to know if there are grass snakes on Anglesey nowadays? So if you see any indication of them while you're near any of the lakes or fens or anything like that, that would be a really great contribution to confirm if they're still found on Anglesey today. Then there are a number of ways in which surveyors can contribute to long-term projects. One that's operating on a national basis, has been going since 2005, but is still very happy to recruit new observers, is Make the Adder Count. That's again on the ARG UK website. And this basically is a project looking at population trends in individual adder populations that involves going out between 3 and 5 times, ideally 5 or 6 times during the main spring period when the males emerge from hibernation and lie out for about a month before the mating season, and counting the number of adders you see and filing the peak count every year. This has been going since 2005, and it's already yielded some interesting and rather unfortunate results for the adder in the UK. This came out 2 years ago now, Make the Adder Count, Population Trends from a Citizen Science Survey of UK Adders in the Herpetological Journal. It's open access. And it showed, among other things, that most of the populations in the UK are rather small populations with peak counts under 10. And most of those small sites are declining, as shown in the graph on the left here. And the relatively small number of larger sites, 12 sites in fact out of 130, have more than, with more than 10 individuals, those actually seem to be doing okay. So the pattern that's emerging here is that the vast majority of adder sites in the UK are declining and will probably trend towards extinction over the next decade or two. And it's only in a relatively small number of sites where larger populations are holding their own. Clearly, having more data on this and having more data from more parts of the country, Wales is not strongly represented, would be great. So this is something, if you know of an adder site and you go there anyway, this would be a great thing to participate in. The survey also highlighted some of the main negative and positive impacts on these sites. And this is the bar diagram here. By far the most common negative impact was public pressure. So that's just lots of people being there, dog walkers, but also budding herpetologists who go and catch snakes to photograph and things like that. Interestingly, the second most impactful thing was habitat management, which was both positive, where conservation management was done well, but also negative, where a lot of conservation management, which is probably aimed at other species, is actually extremely detrimental to adders, and sadly, that's a very common observation. So taking part in long-term recording schemes like this can build up our knowledge of the conservation status of local herps and adders in particular. Filing these data with Cofnod at the same time is obviously even better because then they are available through that portal as well. Finally, if you regularly record reptiles, there's another initiative going by ARG UK, which is to produce a kind of DNA bank for British reptiles for population genetic surveys. Reptiles will shed their skins. It's usually far more obvious with snakes than with lizards, although if you have good eyes, you may find bits of lizard skin in the bushes as well. If you find any sheds, then these sheds do in fact retain enough DNA for population genetic analyses. There are a number of projects in the works being planned at the moment, basically trying to understand what the genetic health of British reptile populations looks like. Most of our reptile populations live in small isolated populations. There's a risk of inbreeding, loss of genetic variety. That, especially with climate change loosing, is going to reduce their ability to adapt to novel challenges. So we really need to have a better idea of the genetic diversity and genetic health of our reptile populations. Now, because reptiles conveniently shed bits of skin all over the place, which can be identified and used for DNA, ARG UK is running a sort of reptile slough gene bank project. And the basic idea is that if you find a reasonably fresh reptile shed, then collect it. It doesn't have to be entire, although obviously as much as possible is great. If it's been there for weeks and there's in a million bits, then there's probably not much point. But if it's reasonably fresh and intact, then yes, definitely. You then collect these, you keep these separate. That's really key, because otherwise you're going to get contamination of DNA from one specimen to another, which would be very confusing. So put them into little, I don't know, plastic bags or small plastic sample bags or things like that. Don't keep them all separate. Record where you've got them from, GPS coordinates or grid reference, or, you know, as close as you can, basically. If they're damp, then the best thing is to hang them out to dry somewhere on a laundry rack or something like that. Not in the sun, because UV rays destroy DNA. So just get them to dry, and then stick them into a nice dry paper envelope, label them, species, location, dates, and especially your name and contact details. And at the end of the season, send them to the Ark Trust in Bournemouth, where they're maintaining this DNA gene bank. It's a very simple way of contributing. We're trying a number of different approaches now, launching new initiatives to look at the conservation genetics of British reptiles. This will be a very concrete help to those projects. So that would be a great, very helpful thing to do. Finally, disturbance has been mentioned. So, I mean, some reptiles are highly susceptible to disturbance. I think adders are the ones that people worry about the most. There's a great article by Brett Lewis on his blog back from 2014 on the impact of wildlife photography on adders. Adders are a bit of a sort of trophy photography. They're easy to find in spring and midsummer, if you know, late summer, when you know where to look, and people tend to go there and they photograph them and they disturb them and they catch them and they pose them. And adders really need that time to be able to bask in the spring. The males need to do that in order to ripen their sperm, ready for the mating season a bit later in the spring. If you see adders lying out in mid to late summer, it's probably a gravid female that really needs every photon she can get in order to ripen her embryos. So this kind of disturbance can be really quite deleterious. So when you're surveying, try to avoid disturbance. Mick already mentioned that. Obviously, a lot of the time you first see a reptile when you disturb it and it moves off. That's not a problem. Don't feel bad about that. On the other hand, if you see a reptile from a distance, then in an ideal world, you record it, you take your photo from a distance, and as you tiptoe away, you should be really happy with yourself if that reptile is still basking where it is undisturbed. And then also, as I mentioned from the survey, from the Make the Adder Count survey, public disturbance has been identified as the major threat for adders as well as some other species. So be aware of the fact that other people may be very interested in seeing adders, photographing adders and things like that. So, you know, the Cofnod Atlas gives locality down to 1 kilometer, which is probably not so bad, but don't go any further than that. Don't show exact photos of where they are, and beware of what you share on social media. It's probably worth just not advertising reptile sites too much and keeping them confidential as far as possible, because there are people who will come out and pester them regularly. I've certainly had to remind students multiple times of our responsibilities and things like that. It is an issue, so keeping site details reasonably confidential is usually a good idea if you see a lot of reptiles, particularly adders, but also the others. So apart from that, yeah, thank you to everybody who has contributed records. I hope many more people will do so. I think it's a key part of monitoring and conserving our reptiles, and it's great fun. So I hope you get the chance to go out a bit later this year and enjoy it and have fun. Thank you.